There is something both intoxicating and unsettling about the thought of kings who ruled as gods, men and women who bore the burden of eternity upon their shoulders, closing their eyes each night and stepping into a ritual so secret that even whispers of it survived only as fragments in the sands of history. The pharaohs, radiant figures carved into the memory of civilization, did not simply preside over their golden thrones with worldly might, they carried within them an almost unbearable awareness of their role as bridges between heaven and earth. To rule Egypt was not merely to manage a kingdom of stone and river, but to embody the very axis of existence, to stand at the scene where the mortal dissolves into the infinite. And it was in the quiet of night, in chambers hidden from the eyes of the multitudes, that they performed a ritual both deeply practical and endlessly cosmic. This ritual, practiced every night without fail, was not simply an act of tradition or superstition. It was a confrontation, a surrender, a renewal. To speak of it is to touch the architecture of a worldview in which the seen and unseen intertwined like reeds along the Nile, in which time was not a linear passage but a cyclical dance, a breathing of the cosmos itself. The pharaoh, wrapped in silence and shadow, enacted something that bound together the pulse of his own heart with the rhythm of the stars above. What could compel the most powerful rulers on earth to bow before the mystery of night, to immerse themselves in an act hidden from the applause of their subjects? What was it they feared, or perhaps revered, so much that this nightly engagement became indispensable? Imagine for a moment that we are not merely studying dusty fragments or ornate hieroglyphs, but stepping into that chamber with them. The air is thick with the perfume of resins, the flicker of oil lamps casting shifting shadows that seem to dance upon the walls like spirits. A stillness reigns, as though the entire palace has held its breath. And within this stillness, the pharaoh begins, his movements deliberate, his words measured, his silence louder than thunder. The ritual unfolds not as an external spectacle but as an inward voyage, one in which the ruler unravels himself layer by layer until he is no longer sovereign but seeker, no longer master of lands but traveler of the unseen river that flows through all beings. We tend to think of rituals as archaic gestures, remnants of a world less enlightened than ours. Yet what if these nightly acts were not mere superstition but keys to understanding consciousness itself? The pharaohs, in their intuitive grasp of reality, may have recognized something we have forgotten, that the night is not merely the absence of daylight but the womb of rebirth, a portal through which the self dies and is remade. To go to sleep without awareness is to let the hours consume you unconsciously, but to enter the night with deliberate ritual is to dance with the gods of darkness and dawn, to court the power that dissolves and resurrects. The ancient Egyptians spoke of Ma'at, the principle of truth, harmony, and balance that governed the cosmos. The pharaoh was not simply a man, he was the living embodiment of Ma'at. Each decision he made, each judgment he pronounced, was expected to mirror the cosmic order. Yet no mortal could bear such a weight without renewal. Just as the sun god Ra sailed his bark through the treacherous underworld each night, battling chaos before rising again at dawn, so too the pharaoh entered his private underworld through this ritual. To refuse it, or to neglect it, would not merely be a personal failing but a cosmic fracture, a disturbance in the balance of the world. This nightly practice carried an almost scientific precision beneath its mystical veil. The Egyptians did not separate the spiritual from the practical, for to them they were one and the same. To realign oneself nightly with the cosmic order was not only to honor the gods but to ensure the fertility of the Nile, the stability of the kingdom, the flourishing of the people. Without such inner recalibration, power could corrode, judgment could falter, and chaos, the great enemy of Ma'at, could seep into the very foundations of the land. Thus the pharaoh's ritual was as much about governance as it was about transcendence. It was the invisible labor that underpinned the golden splendor seen by the world. And yet, beyond the weight of duty and the burden of cosmic balance, there was also something deeply human in it. The pharaoh, for all his divine titles, was still a man who felt fear in the darkness, who wrestled with doubts that even armies could not silence. To perform this ritual was to step naked before the infinite, to acknowledge that beneath the crown and regalia lay a soul no less fragile than any other. This is where the ritual becomes most astonishing, for it reveals that the pharaohs, though elevated, were engaged in the same existential struggle that defines us all. They too sought to anchor themselves against the tides of uncertainty, to awaken each morning not as hollow vessels of power but as beings aligned with something greater than themselves. If we peel back the layers of myth and history, we begin to see that what they practiced was not merely an ancient curiosity but a universal truth disguised in symbols. We, too, carry our own nightly rituals, though they may lack the incense and solemnity of old. When we close our eyes, when we drift into sleep, we also step into the unknown, surrendering our certainties to a vast and formless night. The pharaohs chose not to drift but to step with intention. Perhaps they knew that every dawn is a resurrection, and to be reborn wisely one must die consciously each night. This is why their secret becomes mind-blowing, not because it is shrouded in exotic mystery, but because it holds a mirror to our own lives. We may not wear crowns, yet we rule our own small kingdoms of choice and consequence. We may not govern the Nile, yet we navigate currents of chaos and order within ourselves daily. What would it mean if we, too, took the night not as a passive collapse into unconsciousness but as a deliberate passage, or ritual of renewal? Would our mornings not carry a different light, our days a different strength? Thus, to speak of why the pharaohs practiced this secret ritual every night is to open a door not just into ancient Egypt but into the very architecture of human existence. It is to listen for the echoes of an old wisdom that still vibrates in our bones, to rediscover the rhythm of death and rebirth that pulses through every day we live. And as we follow the path of this exploration, we will see not only the ritual itself but the themes and truths it encodes, the symbolic stories it whispers, and the ways in which it continues to shape the very fabric of human life. The question remains, hovering like the moon over the Nile, do we dare to step into this chamber with the pharaohs, to trace the outlines of their nightly act and uncover the truths they concealed? If so, let us continue. At the heart of the pharaoh's nightly ritual lay a web of themes so intricately woven that to tug at one thread reveals an entire tapestry of cosmic philosophy. To understand why this practice was repeated night after night, uninterrupted by war, celebration, or fatigue, we must first dwell upon the central pillars that gave it meaning. These were not ideas restricted to palaces and temples but reflections of a worldview that saw the universe as alive, breathing, and perpetually in dialogue with the human soul. One of the first great concepts underpinning the ritual was the dance between order and chaos. To the Egyptians, chaos, what they called Isfet, was not an abstract inconvenience but a tangible force ever threatening to dissolve the fragile harmony of the world. Against it stood Ma'at, the principle of truth, balance, and divine order. The pharaoh, as the axis of the cosmos, was charged with keeping Ma'at alive. Each night, as darkness wrapped the earth, it was as though Isfet pressed closer, whispering dissonance and disorder into the cracks of existence. The ritual was the pharaoh's nightly stand against this encroaching void, a rehearsal of the eternal battle fought by the gods themselves. This was no empty theater. The Egyptians saw the journey of Ra, the sun god, as a mirror to their own cycles of living. Each day Ra shone brightly across the world, but when he descended into night, he was forced to sail through the underworld's turbulent waters. He encountered serpents of chaos, spirits of confusion, and trials that tested his very essence. Only by conquering these could he rise again at dawn, reborn and radiant. The pharaoh's nightly ritual was a reenactment of this cosmic voyage. By entering symbolic darkness, by confronting silence and shadow, he aligned himself with Ra's struggle, ensuring that the sun would rise not only in the heavens but also within his soul. Another essential theme was the acknowledgement of duality. The Egyptians did not split the world into clean binaries of good and evil, light and dark, sacred and profane. Instead, they embraced duality as two wings of the same bird, necessary for flight. Night was not merely absence but potential, a fertile void from which light could be born anew. The ritual recognized this truth. The pharaoh did not deny darkness but entered it willingly, trusting that within its folds lay the seed of dawn. In doing so, he embodied a philosophy that our modern world often forgets, that the path to renewal is not avoidance of shadow but integration of it. Closely tied to this was the theme of cyclical time. To us, time often feels like a straight arrow, propelling us forward relentlessly. But for the Egyptians, time was circular, repeating itself in eternal spirals. The sun's rise and fall, the flooding and retreat of the Nile, the seasons of sowing and harvest, all were echoes of an underlying rhythm. The ritual, practiced every night without exception, was the pharaoh's way of stepping into this eternal cycle consciously. By doing so, he was not a prisoner of time but its participant, choosing to engage with its turning rather than drift aimlessly within it. This was more than ceremony, it was a declaration that the ruler was not outside the cosmic dance but bound into its very steps. There was also the theme of death and resurrection, perhaps the most profound of all. For the Egyptians, death was never an end but a transformation, a passage into another state of being. Each night, when the pharaoh performed his ritual, he symbolically died. His crown and title dissolved in the silence of the chamber, leaving behind only a soul naked before eternity. And in the morning, he rose again, reclothed not only in garments of royalty but in the renewed essence of one who had conquered death in miniature. The ritual was thus a training ground for the final journey, a rehearsal for the moment when his body would rest in the tomb, and his spirit would sail beyond the horizon of the known. Interwoven with these themes was the recognition of the microcosm and the macrocosm, the idea that what occurred within the pharaoh's soul rippled outward to shape the cosmos. If he faltered in his inner alignment, the land itself would tremble. If he succeeded in harmonizing with Ma'at, the floods would come on time, crops would flourish, and the people would thrive. This was not metaphor for them but reality. The inner state of the ruler and the outer state of the kingdom were mirrors. Thus, the nightly ritual was not indulgence but necessity, a way to keep the great mirror polished so that heaven and earth could reflect one another without distortion. And finally, woven through all of these was the theme of consciousness itself. The Egyptians recognized something our scientific age is only beginning to rediscover, that awareness is not a passive flame but a creative force. To direct one's awareness into the night, to step with intent into the river of darkness, was to shape the outcome of dawn itself. The pharaoh did not surrender to unconscious sleep, he sailed consciously through the waters of the unseen. In this sense, the ritual was an act of mastery over the self, a declaration that even in the most vulnerable hours, when the body lay at rest, the spirit remained vigilant. When we contemplate these themes, order versus chaos, duality, cyclical time, death and resurrection, the unity of microcosm and macrocosm, and the power of consciousness, we begin to see why the pharaohs bound themselves to this nightly act with such devotion. It was not superstition but alignment, not habit but lifeline. And though centuries separate us from their temples and tombs, these same themes still pulse beneath our daily lives. We, too, wrestle with chaos and long for balance. We, too, fear the night yet sense its hidden promise. We, too, live in cycles, even if we pretend time is a straight line. And like the pharaohs, we, too, are called to die and rise, to let go of who we were so that we may awaken to who we might become. The brilliance of the pharaohs was not merely in their monuments of stone but in their monuments of practice, in the recognition that human life is fragile yet luminous, finite yet tied to infinity, and that without conscious renewal, even the greatest power dissolves into dust. Their ritual, when understood through these themes, becomes less a relic of the past and more a mirror held up to our present, reminding us of truths we cannot afford to forget. The pharaohs were not philosophers in the way we imagine modern thinkers, scribbling arguments in dusty volumes. They were storytellers in ritual form, living embodiments of myths that reached beyond words. Their nightly ritual was not simply a performance but a narrative enacted in silence, a myth breathed into reality. To glimpse its power, we must look at the symbolic stories that shaped their understanding, stories that allowed them to weave meaning into every gesture, every pause, every whispered invocation. Consider first the most famous myth of Ra's nightly voyage. As the sun god slipped beyond the horizon, he entered the Duat, the Egyptian underworld, a realm both treacherous and luminous. There he sailed in his solar bark, a vessel gliding upon the dark waters, surrounded by companions who represented aspects of his divine essence. Yet each night he faced the serpent Apophis, the embodiment of chaos. Apophis sought to devour the light, to swallow Ra whole, ensuring that dawn would never come. But Ra, aided by spells and courage, pierced the serpent, overcoming darkness and ensuring that morning would once again bless the earth. The pharaoh's ritual echoed this journey. Each night he was Ra descending into the unseen, each word of his ritual a weapon against Apophis, each silence a passage through turbulent waters. In this story, the pharaoh was both man and god, both participant and symbol. By reenacting Ra's journey, he reminded himself, in the cosmos, that order must continually be defended, that light is not guaranteed but must be reborn anew each day. Yet Ra's story was only one among many. Another deeply symbolic tale was that of Osiris, the god of the afterlife, who was betrayed and slain by his brother Set. His body, torn into fragments and scattered across Egypt, seemed lost forever. But through the devotion of his consort Isis, the pieces were gathered, restored, and Osiris rose again, not as king of the living but as ruler of the dead, guardian of the passage beyond. The nightly ritual of the pharaoh carried Osiris's resonance, for in its essence it was a symbolic dismemberment and reassembly. The pharaoh allowed his worldly identity to be broken apart, stripped down to nothingness, before gathering himself again in renewed wholeness by dawn. He became Osiris descending into death, and Horus, his divine heir, rising anew. In this sense, the ritual was not a single story but a weaving of many myths, each thread contributing to the larger tapestry of meaning. Through Ra's victory over Apophis, the pharaoh aligned himself with the eternal triumph of light over chaos. Through Osiris's resurrection, he embraced the truth that life emerges from death, that wholeness is often born from brokenness. Through Horus's succession, he affirmed continuity, ensuring that order flows unbroken from one day to the next. The Egyptians encoded these stories not only in words but in symbols carved into stone, painted upon tomb walls, etched into amulets and jewelry. To step into an ancient tomb was to step into a library of symbols, each image a fragment of the greater narrative. A scarab beetle rolling its ball of earth symbolized the sun's endless rebirth. The lotus flower, blooming each morning from the Nile's surface, embodied purity and renewal. The falcon soaring high represented vision and divine kingship. The nightly ritual was a living conversation with these symbols, a choreography of gestures that spoke in the language of the cosmos. Imagine the pharaoh, alone in his chamber, tracing the shape of the scarab in his mind, whispering invocations that mirrored the rising lotus, envisioning himself as the falcon ascending beyond limitation. Each act was layered with meaning, not because of superstition but because symbols bypassed the mind and spoke directly to the soul. They were not decorations but doorways, portals into dimensions of awareness that words alone could not reach. There is a story, perhaps more allegory than history, that tells of a young pharaoh who, in his arrogance, once dismissed the nightly ritual. For several nights he chose not to perform it, convinced that his power was sufficient without such ancient practices. Yet during those nights the Nile failed to rise, the people grew restless, and his dreams were plagued by serpents and shadows. Alarmed, he returned to the ritual, bowing before its mystery, and soon the waters flowed once more. Whether this tale is literal or symbolic hardly matters. Its message is clear: the ritual was not about maintaining appearances but about sustaining harmony, within and without. Neglect it, an imbalance would ripple through the fabric of reality. But perhaps the most profound symbolic narrative of all is the one hidden in plain sight, the story of sleep itself. To the Egyptians, sleep was a cousin of death, a nightly rehearsal for the final crossing. Each time the pharaoh lay down, he entered a miniature underworld, vulnerable and unguarded. The ritual transformed this vulnerability into strength, converting sleep from passive surrender into conscious passage. In this way, the pharaoh became a bridge between myth and biology, merging the symbolic stories of gods with the lived rhythms of the human body. Through these layered narratives, we begin to see that the pharaoh's nightly practice was not a single act but a symphony of meaning. Each symbol, each myth, was like a note in a song that resonated across time, reminding both ruler and realm of their place in the grand order of existence. And though centuries separate us from the temples where these stories were whispered, their essence still lingers. We, too, live in myths, though we may not name them as such. Our daily struggles, our falls and risings, our battles with inner serpents, all echo the same archetypal stories. The pharaohs simply lived them with conscious intention, allowing their rituals to embody truths that transcend the ages. And so the nightly ritual becomes more than an historical curiosity. It is an allegory of life itself, a symbolic enactment of the eternal cycles that shape every being. To study it is to study ourselves, for within its symbols we find our own reflection, the endless voyage through darkness into dawn, the breaking and remaking of the self, the victory of light over the shadows that dwell within. It is easy to relegate the Pharaoh's nightly ritual to the realm of myth and antiquity, imagining it as something that belonged to palaces long swallowed by desert sands. Yet to do so is to miss the deeper revelation, that the Pharaohs were not simply performing an act for themselves but modeling a way of being that remains as urgent now as it was thousands of years ago. Their ritual, in its essence, was a map of human consciousness, a guide for how to live, sleep, and awaken in alignment with the deeper currents of existence. The question that lingers for us, then, is not merely why they practiced it, but how we might translate its wisdom into our own lives. We live in an age saturated with noise. Our nights, rather than being sanctuaries of renewal, are often consumed by the glow of screens, the endless scroll of distraction, the racing thoughts that refuse to quiet. We collapse into sleep without intention, and so we awaken carrying the residue of chaos. The Pharaohs understood that night was not a pause but a threshold, not an emptiness but a womb of transformation. To bring their wisdom into the present is to reclaim the night as sacred space, to enter sleep not as unconscious drift but as conscious renewal. This does not require incense, golden thrones, or temples of stone. It requires only a shift of awareness, a willingness to approach the end of each day as the Pharaohs did, with reverence. Imagine creating a small ritual for yourself, not out of superstition but out of recognition that the state in which you enter the night shapes the day that follows. Perhaps it begins with a moment of silence, a deliberate breath, a letting go of the clutter of the day. Perhaps it is the writing of a single line in a journal, an offering of gratitude or a naming of what you wish to release. In such gestures, however simple, lies the same essence that guided the Pharaohs, the transformation of sleep into a conscious passage. The Pharaoh's ritual also invites us to reconsider how we engage with cycles. We often resist them, clinging to the illusion of linear progress, of constant ascent. Yet life is cyclical, light and darkness, energy and rest, birth and death, growth and decay. The Pharaohs embraced this truth, stepping willingly into the nightly descent so they could rise renewed. When we deny our cycles, pushing through exhaustion, ignoring the need for rest, fearing the inevitable downturns, we suffer. To live with greater balance is to honor the cycle, to see endings not as failures but as necessary preludes to rebirth. The ritual, then, becomes a reminder to trust the ebb and flow of our own lives, to see each fall not as loss but as preparation for renewal. Another practical thread lies in the Pharaoh's acknowledgement of chaos and order. They did not imagine life could be stripped of chaos. Instead, they recognized that chaos is always near, whispering at the edges of stability. The ritual was their way of meeting chaos daily, confronting it before it spilled into the kingdom. We, too, face our serpents, those voices of doubt, anxiety, distraction, or despair. Too often we attempt to silence them by avoidance, numbing ourselves with distractions. Yet the Pharaohs teach a different way. Meet the serpent, name it, look it in the eye. When we bring our awareness to the chaos within, we disarm it. The ritual becomes not about banishing chaos but about transforming it, about finding order even in the presence of turbulence. There's also the theme of responsibility. For the Pharaoh, neglecting the ritual was not merely a personal matter but a cosmic danger. His inner misalignment threatened the stability of the entire kingdom. While we may not rule over nations, we do rule over the smaller kingdoms of our families, our communities, our work, and above all, ourselves. When we neglect our own inner balance, it ripples outward. Our impatience becomes someone else's burden. Our unchecked anger becomes another's wound. By cultivating our own nightly renewal, we indirectly nourish those around us. The Pharaoh's wisdom reminds us that self-alignment is not selfishness but service, for only when we are whole can we offer wholeness to others. The ritual also offers a lesson in humility. The Pharaoh, crowned with divine authority, stripped himself nightly of titles and stood naked before the mystery of existence. In doing so, he remembered that beneath the grandeur of power he was still a soul on a journey. How many of us, caught in the roles we play, professional, parent, leader, student, forget the same truth? We identify so fully with our masks that we lose touch with the self beneath. To integrate the Pharaoh's wisdom is to practice this stripping away, to remind ourselves each night that we are more than the roles we wear, and to awaken each morning not merely as an actor in society but as a being renewed in essence. And finally, the ritual invites us to reconsider the meaning of death. In our culture, death is often shunned, feared, hidden away. But the pharaohs rehearsed it nightly, embracing it as a teacher rather than an enemy. Each ritual was a miniature death, a letting go of identity, a practice of surrender. When we incorporate this perspective, even subtly, into our own lives, death loses some of its terror. Each ending, be it of a day, a relationship, a season of life, becomes not annihilation but transformation. To live with this awareness is to live with less fear, more courage, and greater peace. Thus, the pharaoh's nightly ritual, though cloaked in the trappings of antiquity, is not irrelevant. It is a guide for modern living, urging us to bring intention to our nights, awareness to our cycles, courage to our chaos, humility to our roles, and acceptance to our endings. If we allow even fragments of their wisdom to seep into our routines, we may find that our mornings carry a different light, our days a steadier balance, our lives a deeper harmony. In truth, we may not need to copy their rituals exactly, for the essence is not in the form but in the spirit. What matters is that we, like them, recognize the night as sacred, the cycles as trustworthy, and the self as capable of renewal. When we do, we step into the same stream that flowed through the pharaohs, a river of wisdom that continues to nourish across the ages. When we peel back the veils of time, when we walk barefoot across the sands of history and lean into the silence of tombs, we find that the pharaohs were never merely rulers obsessed with power and legacy. They were custodians of a wisdom that reached beyond pyramids and palaces, guardians of truths that concern not only kingdoms but the architecture of the soul itself. Their nightly ritual, hidden from the gaze of the world, was less a ceremony for the throne and more a dialogue with the cosmos, a conversation between moral fragility and eternal order. And now, as we stand centuries removed, surrounded by the din of modern life, we are left with a startling realization: the ritual was never theirs alone. It was always a human inheritance, a map drawn not in hieroglyphs but in the language of existence itself. To step into the pharaoh's chamber, even imaginatively, is to step into our own. The oil lamps may be gone, the chants forgotten, but the essence remains alive, waiting for us to awaken to it. What they understood with astonishing clarity is that every night is a death and every dawn a resurrection. To live unconsciously is to stumble through this cycle without awareness, waking each day as though nothing has changed. But to live consciously, as they did, is to recognize that each night offers the chance to shed what no longer serves, to step into the underworld of our own shadows, and to rise in the morning lighter, clearer, more aligned. In this sense, the pharaoh's ritual was not a relic of the past but an eternal invitation. Will you meet the night as a tomb or as a womb? The metaphor stretches even further. In a world increasingly fractured by chaos, uncertainty, and disconnection, we too are called to defend Ma'at, the principle of harmony, truth, and balance. Our battles with chaos may not involve serpents in the underworld, but they do involve the unseen forces of anxiety, distraction, despair, and division. Like the pharaohs, we cannot banish these forces completely, but we can meet them with awareness, courage, and ritual. Every moment of intention, every act of renewal, is a small victory over the apophis of our time. And what of power? The pharaohs remind us that true power is not in domination but in alignment. They carried crowns of gold, yet every night they set them aside, knowing that sovereignty over a kingdom meant little if sovereignty over the self was lost. In their humility lies our lesson: whatever thrones we occupy, be they careers, families, dreams, or relationships, are sustained not by our outward strength alone but by our inward balance. When we neglect the inner ritual, our outer world trembles. But when we cultivate it, even quietly, we become pillars of steadiness in a world that desperately longs for equilibrium. Perhaps the most mind-blowing aspect of their nightly practice is not its exotic mystery but its startling simplicity. They turned toward the night with awareness. They honored the cycle. They faced the shadow. They surrendered the crown of the day to be reborn at dawn. We, too, can do this. No temple is required, no elaborate chant, no golden amulet. only the decision to meet each night not as an unconscious collapse but as a sacred passage. Only the willingness to let go, to enter the darkness, to allow death in miniature so that life and abundance may follow. The call, then, is not to mimic the Pharaohs but to embody their wisdom in forms that fit our lives. For one person, it may be the practice of journaling before bed, releasing the burdens of the day. For another, it may be a moment of silence, a whispered prayer, or simply the conscious act of breathing deeply before sleep. For yet another, it may be the decision to let go of the role they were during the day and remember, if only briefly, that they are more than titles, more than identities, they are beings in the endless dance of death and rebirth. This is not romantic idealism but practical necessity. The Pharaohs did not perform their ritual because it was pleasant or ornamental. They did it because without renewal, without alignment, chaos would win. The same is true for us. Without intentional practices of grounding and renewal, we drift into the current of modern chaos, consumed by fatigue, stress, and disconnection. But with them, even in the simplest forms, we rediscover balance. We awaken not only refreshed but reoriented, anchored in truths that no chaos can dissolve. And so the story of the Pharaoh's nightly ritual does not end in ancient Egypt. It ends, and begins again, in each of us. Every evening, as the sun falls, we are given the same choice they faced, to enter the night unconsciously, letting chaos seep into our dreams, or to enter it with awareness, choosing ritual, choosing renewal, choosing to be reborn. Each morning, as dawn breaks, we rise not merely to another day but to another chance, to realign, to recommit, to embody the balance that sustains both our inner and outer worlds. Let this be the transformation the Pharaohs whisper to us across time, that life is not sustained by monuments of stone but by monuments of practice, that the truest crowns are worn not upon the head but within the heart, and that the secret ritual is not locked in history but waiting in the quiet of our own nights. The invitation is eternal, the question simple: will you meet the night consciously, will you awaken deliberately, will you live in harmony with the dance of death and rebirth? If you choose to step into this rhythm, then you, too, become a pharaoh of your own life, not a ruler of lands, but a sovereign of the self, one who can navigate chaos, honor cycles, embrace death, and rise renewed with every dawn.